Charles I, the second son of King James VI of Scotland and Anne of Denmark, was born a sickly child. He was not expected to live long, let alone inherit the throne. When his elder brother Henry died unexpectedly in 1612, Charles became heir apparent to both the Scottish and English thrones. This event cast a long shadow over the young prince. He was thrust into a position of immense power and responsibility, burdens for which he was ill-prepared. Charles was a quiet and introspective child, in stark contrast to his charismatic father. He was deeply religious, a devout Protestant with a strong belief in the divine right of kings. This belief, instilled in him from an early age, would later shape his reign and ultimately lead to his downfall. Despite his physical frailty, Charles possessed a strong will and a stubborn streak. He was not a man easily swayed from his convictions, a trait that would later put him at odds with his parliament. England in the early 17th century was a nation in flux. The Elizabethan era, with its relative peace and prosperity, was fading into memory. Religious tensions simmered between Catholics and Protestants. The English Reformation, initiated by Henry VIII, had left the country religiously divided. The embers of this conflict, though dormant, were far from extinguished. Economic anxieties also gripped the nation. Inflation soared, fueled by the influx of silver from the New World. The traditional social order was under strain as a new merchant class challenged the old aristocracy. Parliament, representing the interests of the landed gentry and merchants, grew increasingly assertive in its dealings with the monarchy. The seeds of conflict between Crown and Parliament, which would later erupt into civil war, were sown during these turbulent times. Charles had ascended the English throne in 1625 upon the death of his father, James I. The young king inherited a kingdom beset by challenges, both domestic and foreign. Almost immediately, Charles found himself at odds with Parliament over issues of taxation and foreign policy. His marriage to Henrietta Maria, a Catholic French princess, further inflamed religious tensions in England. Charles's belief in the divine right of kings, a doctrine asserting that monarchs derived their authority directly from God, put him on a collision course with Parliament. He saw any challenge to his authority as an affront to God's will, a stance that alienated many of his subjects. His attempts to raise funds without Parliament's consent through forced loans and the revival of outdated feudal dues further eroded his support. In 1629, frustrated by Parliament's resistance to his policies, Charles I dissolved Parliament and embarked on a period of personal rule. For 11 years, he governed without summoning Parliament, a move that proved deeply unpopular. To finance his government, Charles resorted to increasingly desperate measures. He levied ship money, a medieval tax originally intended for coastal defence, on inland counties, sparking widespread resentment. Charles's religious policies also proved divisive. Under the influence of William Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Charles attempted to impose a more elaborate and ceremonial form of worship on the Church of England. This High Anglicanism, as it was known, was seen by many Puritans as a step towards Catholicism. Religious dissent grew, further undermining Charles's authority. Section 5. The road to war tensions reach a boiling point. The fragile peace that Charles had imposed on England unravelled in 1638 with the outbreak of the Bishops' Wars. These conflicts, sparked by Charles's attempt to impose a new prayer book on the Scottish Presbyterian Church, exposed the limits of the king's authority. Unable to defeat the Scots militarily, Charles was forced to recall Parliament in 1640 to raise funds for a new army. The Parliament that assembled, known as the Short Parliament, proved no more amenable to Charles's demands than its predecessor. It refused to grant him funds until he addressed their grievances, which included his 11 years of personal rule, his religious policies, and his arbitrary financial measures. Charles, enraged by Parliament's defiance, dissolved it after only 3 weeks. Section 6. The English Civil War. A nation divided. The dissolution of the short Parliament proved to be a fatal miscalculation. Faced with renewed rebellion in Scotland, Charles was forced to recall Parliament once more in November 1640. This time, however, Parliament was determined to assert its authority. Led by John Pym, a skilled parliamentarian, the House of Commons passed a series of measures designed to curb the King's power. The Grand Remonstrance, a lengthy document outlining Parliament's grievances, was presented to Charles in December 1640. It accused him of tyranny, corruption, and subverting the laws of England. Charles, outraged by these accusations, attempted to arrest Pym and 4 other members of Parliament for treason. This act, widely seen as an attack on Parliament itself, proved to be the final straw. In August 1642, the English Civil War began. Section 7. Defeat and imprisonment, the King's fortunes turn. The English Civil War was a brutal and bloody conflict that pitted Charles I and his royalist supporters against the parliamentarians led by Oliver Cromwell. Despite some early victories, Charles's forces were gradually worn down by the parliamentarians' superior military organisation and resources. The Battle of Marston Moor in 1644 and the Battle of Naseby in 1645 proved decisive, shattering the royalist army and leaving Charles with little choice but to surrender to the Scots in 1646. The Scots, initially allied with Parliament, had grown wary of the growing power of the army under Cromwell. They hoped to negotiate a settlement that would preserve the monarchy while securing their own interests. However, Charles, still clinging to his belief in the divine right of kings, refused to compromise. In 1647, the Scots handed him over to Parliament, who imprisoned him at Hampton Court Palace. Section 8. The Trial and Execution of Charles I, a monarchy on trial. Charles's imprisonment did little to quell the political turmoil engulfing England. The parliamentarians were themselves divided, with moderates seeking a negotiated settlement with the king and radicals demanding his trial and execution. In December 1648, Colonel Thomas Pride, acting on Cromwell's orders, purged Parliament of its moderate members, leaving a rump Parliament dominated by Cromwell and his supporters. The rump Parliament declared that the people of England, through their representatives in Parliament, were the ultimate source of political authority. Charles was charged with high treason against the people of England. His trial, which began in January 1649, was a revolutionary event, the first time in English history that a reigning monarch had been subjected to a public trial. Charles, refusing to recognise the legitimacy of the court, maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Section 9. Legacy of a Fallen King, Charles I's enduring impact. On a cold January day in 1649, Charles I was beheaded on a scaffold erected outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. His execution sent shockwaves throughout Europe. It marked the end of the English Civil War and the beginning of the Interregnum, a period of Republican rule under Oliver Cromwell. Charles's death did not, however, extinguish the flames of conflict. The monarchy was restored in 1660 with the accession of Charles II, but the legacy of the Civil War, with its profound questions about the nature of power, authority, and the rights of the people, continued to shape English history. Charles I remains a controversial figure in British history. To his supporters, he was a martyr, a righteous king who died defending his God-given rights. To his detractors, he was a tyrant, a stubborn and inflexible ruler whose actions plunged England into civil war. His reign, marked by conflict, tragedy, and ultimately his own execution, serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the importance of the rule of law. Section 10. Conclusion. Reflecting on the reign of Charles I. The reign of Charles I was a pivotal period in English history. His unwavering belief in the divine right of kings, coupled with his inability to compromise with Parliament, led to a devastating civil war and his own demise. His execution, a stark reminder of the limits of royal authority, paved the way for a new era in English politics. Though the monarchy was eventually restored, the events of the English Civil War and the interregnum left an indelible mark on the English psyche. They helped to foster a deep-seated suspicion of absolute power and a commitment to the principle of parliamentary sovereignty, ideas that would shape the development of English democracy in the centuries to come.